Good morning, my dear children. So let's start introduction to graphs again, and this will be your last class for this chapter. So today our topic is interpretation of graphs. So you know what is a linear graph? What is the difference between a line graph and a linear graph? How to locate a point or the coordinates x and y on a graph sheet, how to construct a linear graph and a line graph. Now let's interpret some of the graphs. Now this is a question from your exercise 15.1. Can there be a time temperature graph as follows? Students, this graph or this types of graph, linear, line and all, you will be dealing in physics also. Physics, if you have gone through the YouTube video which I have given yesterday, you will be knowing that distance, time, distance, speed, time and speed, time temperature graph, all these are coming in your physics chapters. So be thorough with the knowledge of graph. Now let's see a time temperature graph. Here temperature is depicted along y-axis and time is depicted along x-axis. Now without any values, how can you interpret this? This is a linear graph. This is a linear graph. That means now how will you interpret this? That means when the time increases, the temperature also increases uniformly. Isn't it? When time increases, the temperature also increases at a constant rate. At a constant rate. Then only you will get a linear graph like this. Okay? This is an example of direct proportion. This graph indicates a direct proportion. That means when time increases, temperature also increases at a constant rate. It represents a time temperature graph where temperature increases as the time increases. So this type of graphs indicates direct proportion. That means when one quantity increases, the other quantity also increases in a constant rate. Now that is the interpretation of this type of graphs. Let's see the next graph. Now here what happens? The time temperature graph. When time increases, because the time is increasing towards the left. Okay. So here towards right. Time increases, but what happens to the temperature? Temperature decreases. Temperature decreases. You can see the arrow here. So this type of graph depicts an inverse proportion. When one quantity increases, the other quantity decreases. When one quantity increases, the other quantity decreases. So this type of linear graph depicts an inverse proportion. It shows a time temperature graph where temperature decreases as the time increases. So students, this is a graph of direct proportion and this is a graph of inverse proportion. Next. Here, what happens? This is the temperature graph. The time stays constant. You can see the time is not moving. It is along one axis itself, but the temperature goes on increasing. Without time changing, the temperature is changing. This is impossible. This is impossible. So, without the change in time, the temperature cannot change. So, this type of time temperature graph is impossible. Here the temperature is increasing at a constant time, which is not possible. So this type of time temperature graph is not possible. Let's see the fourth one. Here, this is the temperature graph. This is possible. Can you tell me why? Because even if the time increases, the temperature can remain constant. So this type of time temperature graph is possible. This type of time temperature graph is possible. This is regarding time temperature. The previous one which I showed you is about direct and inverse proportion, that you should learn it. This is graph indicating direct proportion and this is inverse proportion. Now next what you have to learn is independent and dependent variables. What is an independent variable? Okay, let's see the answer. It is a variable that stands alone and isn't changed by the other variables you are trying to measure. Okay, I'll give you the example, then I'll come back to the explanation. What is a dependent variable? It is something that depends on other factors. Okay, now just see the example which I am giving you. That will be very easy for you to understand. Time spent studying causes a change in test score. Okay, the time which you spend for learning causes a change in test score. Test score means the marks scored in your class test. Okay, so can you tell me which is the independent and which is the dependent variable? Time spent studying is an independent variable. Okay, I am telling you depends on that person. Okay, I am not asking the parents are compelling you or whatever comes from you. Okay, time spent studying is an independent variable. Okay, but test score is a dependent variable. Why? How much you learn, how much time you spend on a subject will reflect in your marks, isn't it? So this is an independent variable and this is the dependent variable. Why? Test score depends on the time spent on study. So hope you understood what is independent and dependent variable. So here independent variables are usually plotted along x-axis and dependent variables are plotted along y-axis. If you remember the linear graph which we drawn for cost of apples. If you go through your graph notebook, you can see cost of apples. The number of apples is independent. But if you are buying one apple, you should give 5 rupees. If you are increasing the number of apples, the cost also increases. So number of apples is independent. Cost of apples is dependent on the number. Okay. So independent variables are usually plotted along x-axis and dependent variables are plotted along y-axis. By this, my dear children, I am going to end the chapter Introduction to Graph. It's a very important chapter because you have coordinate geometry, quadratic equations based on this in your higher classes. So don't leave this chapter. Study it thoroughly. Till then, take care. Bye.